In today's presentation, Doug's going to talk about fire prevention.
Thank you, Jason. You know, this summer has been such a hot, dry summer. We've been so worried about wildfires and everything. And that is a concern. In fact, you know, wildfires is one way where we could, you know, suffer losses to our property, especially if we live in some of those urban interface areas, or if our, you know, buildings or facilities are in some of these areas. A couple of years ago, there was a fire on a hilltop, you know, right in my neighborhood. There's an open field that's behind a cemetery that, you know, pretty much just has remained open space all these years, and some kids set some fireworks off up there and caught that hill on fire, and several of our neighbors just about lost their houses in that event. And so obviously in the summertime, when we have dry conditions, we're particularly worried about fire prevention, but really this is something we need to be thinking about year round. The fire prevention and fire losses are things that we see at any time of year. And so as we're talking about this today, we're going to try and touch on the most common or the most frequent things that we see that are either obvious fire hazards or that are resulting in fire losses for all of you out there, the trust members. So one of the first things you should do as you are thinking about fire prevention is maybe making sure that you're prepared in case a fire occurs. And one of the things that you need to do is make sure that you've identified what you own and what the property is that you want to make sure that is protected from a risk management standpoint, in that risk transfer where you want to have that insurance in case of a loss. And so schedule it with us. You have property that you need to make sure it's scheduled on your policy. Make sure and add that property to your property schedule. You know, another great thing that you can do is to take video of your facilities and your equipment, or photographs of your facilities and equipment. That can be really helpful as well. And if you choose not to schedule something because you don't want to pay the extra property coverage and you don't think it's a big risk, I just warn you that it's a really good idea to make sure you get approval for that from, you know, your higher ups, whether that's your governing council or whoever that may be, because we have seen in the past where significant property has been lost in fires where we didn't think there was a significant risk of that property burning, and it did. And then sometimes, you know, people may have to answer, you know, why wasn't that included on a property schedule? But I don't want you to be thinking that your risk management for fires is to just make sure that you're insured. Obviously, we don't want to have the loss in the first place. We want to protect both your loss history and ratings for underwriting purposes, but even more importantly, we want to make sure you, your employees, and your facilities are safe, to make sure you have continuity of operations, and to make sure that you don't have to deal with the headache that would be involved with losing, you know, a major facility or important pieces of equipment. So we're going to talk about different ways we can lose property to fire, and what are some of the really simple things that we can look at to help protect us from these kinds of losses. I mentioned wildland fires already. That's a major concern right now during this drought. It's wonderful to look out the window and see a nice rainy day today, but we know that we're going to have more warm weather ahead of us and in the future too. Fireworks is a common thing. That fireworks season hopefully is behind us. And hopefully people have been a lot wiser this year about limiting the use of fireworks and caution they take using fireworks. There's also the possibility of arson. So these are significant causes of loss that sometimes are less out of our control, but there may be some things that we can do to still protect the property from some of those external causes. Some of the internal things that we have a lot of control over that we need to think about are, you know, what are the dumb things that just happen? You know, we've seen injuries and losses from, you know, somebody who was near a fire and they had a can of gas in their hand, and so they kind of like, you know, flung the can away, but in flinging the can away, gas came out of the can and, you know, got on the fire and spread the fire even more. And sometimes it's just, you know, are we thinking through the process And there's other little things that we'll touch on here. Hot work is something we need to think about as well. That's whenever we're doing something like cutting, brazing, welding, where it produces a lot of heat or sparks that could start a fire. Are we taking the appropriate precautions there? There's electrical and mechanical equipment, that can produce an ignition source. And there's also things that we store that may be flammable or combustible that we need to be thinking about how we're controlling those things. So talking about what are some of these dumb ways that we can catch our building on fire or lose something is just having open flames, whether that's a candle or, some other type of, maybe it's a space heater that is burning, kerosene or something like that. Do you have anything or anybody in your facility that likes to light a candle or have some other type of open flame? By policy, we should make sure that we don't have or don't allow open flames in our buildings or in our facilities unless it's something that is a part of our operations and we have procedures in place to control that hazard. Space heaters is a real common one as we go around and as we do inspections on your facilities. We see a lot of employees that have a space heater hidden under their desk. Their toes get cold, at different times of the year, sometimes even in the summertime. If you've got good air conditioning in your building, we'll see people with a space heater under their desk. And so there's things we want to do to make sure that that doesn't result in being the ignition source for a fire. And just some quick tips real quick on the space heaters. Make sure that any space heaters that are being used have tip over protection. If you tip it over, it should have an automatic shut off when it gets to a certain degree of pitch as it's tipping over. Make sure that that's working. You also want to make sure that those space heaters don't get left on. Sometimes people may walk away from their desk at the end of the day or maybe even on a Friday and leave that heater on in a place where there could be combustibles near enough by where a fire could occur. So make sure that those space heaters are turned off when someone isn't right there with that heater. Make sure that you have about a 3-foot space around that space heater and any other combustible items, papers, cardboard boxes, or things like that. Make sure we have good space around that heater and make sure your heater is plugged into a wall outlet. That's really important. You could cause an overload on a power strip where you've got a bunch of other things plugged into that power strip. Those space heaters do take a lot of power. And so we want to do everything possible to prevent that heater from contributing to an overload. So plug it directly into a wall outlet and make sure that the cord on that heater is in good condition. There's no frays in the cord and there's no damage to the plug or to the cord itself. So again, have a policy in place, to make sure that those space heaters in the office are being used safely. Make sure that those heaters are approved. And you can look for those the tag on the heater that shows that it has, that laboratory approval on it. Tip over protection and make sure they're grounded. Make sure that third prong on the plug on the heater hasn't been broken off. And again, make sure that's plugged right into a wall outlet. Other things that could be really basic is your smoking policy. Your employees who smoke, where do they go to have their smoke break? Is it not just far enough away from the entrance to meet the Clean Air Act laws, but is it far enough away from, combustible materials? Is there dry vegetation around the smoking area or other things that could be combustible? And make sure that we have those areas in a safe location and make sure that we provide the appropriate equipment like ashtrays and so forth for putting those cigarette butts out, as well as matches or things that may be lit. Another basic one that we see a lot is, the hole in the ceiling, the fire break, that drywall on your ceiling. It should be an extra thick sheet of drywall to help fire spreading from a room into the rafters and traveling through other parts of the building. And so we often see where holes have been cut into the ceiling or where panels have been removed to do repair work, to pull wires, whatever reason. We need to make sure those holes get closed back up when we're done with that repair work, because that ceiling panel provides an important fire break against fire spreading should we have a fire in that area. We also need to make sure that we have appropriate fire exits, routes of egress for our employees. There should be at least 2 ways out for employees if they need to evacuate the building in an emergency. Make sure the routes that go to those exits are kept clear, that there's nothing obstructing that space. Generally we need, up to 60 inches wide path to have clear to those fire exits. Your fire hydrants and your fire extinguishers are others that need to be kept clear, available, accessible, and tested on a regular basis so that we know that they're working, in proper order. Another common problem that we see is when we have combustibles close to the building. And this is an area where you can actually build in some protection against some of the external problems. If you have a lot of cut combustible materials like stacks of lumber and wood, old pallets, cardboard, that are right up close to the building. It could even be a dumpster, that has a bunch of combustible material in it that is right up against the building. That's an opportunity for the arsonist, to get in there and start a fire that could take down your building real easy. And even if it's not the arsonist, it could be something where it's just an accidental fire, whether that's man-caused or some other condition that gets that material burning and could cause that loss to your building. Let's say there's a wildfire in the area and you have a lot of dry vegetation right up to the building, or these combustible materials stacked up along the building, and those materials could catch fire as that wildfire gets close. It doesn't even have to reach your building. It could just be embers and sparks flying in the air, from a fire nearby that could get those materials. So have a good buffer around your building, depending on the combustibility and the amount of fuel that you have and materials stored around the building. You should have at least 10 to 25 feet around your building that you keep clear of significant quantities of combustible materials. Another area that is also a problem often that we see is where you have those fuel tanks, propane tanks. We need to keep kind of follow the same rule with those. Keep the weeds down and the dry vegetation away from those tanks, as well as the storage of any other combustible materials that could cause a fire to be in contact with or close to that tank, which could result in what we call a bloody, an explosion, when the gases in that tank, reach a certain temperature. We also mentioned hot work. You may have employees that are engaged in, work activity. This isn't work activity in the picture here, but work activities that could produce an ignition source from sparks or other hot conditions. So make sure that if you have work processes that involve, sparks or fire, cutting, brazing, and welding, that you have a hot work permit program in place to make sure that the procedures are being followed to control the potential fire hazard. Make sure you've got fire extinguishing equipment available. Make sure that you've removed, combustible materials from the area where that hot work is being done. Have fire breaks or fire blankets or other break equipment in place to contain those sparks or heat that could be generated from that hot work, or have other ways built into your procedures to make sure that you're isolating that fire source, or if a fire should start. And if you're doing hot work, especially outdoors in an area where there is a lot of dry vegetation, then you may want to institute a program of having a fire watch in place, when those work activities are done. When I was young, I worked as a logger one summer. And in the summer, when we had high fire conditions, and we would be out there either with chainsaws or even just digging tools, like the hose and shovels that we would use for digging fire trails around the areas where we were working. When we were done using those tools that could have caused a spark somewhere, we would have to wait, for a half hour or an hour after we finished our work, just to make sure that nothing we did resulted in an ember, waiting to start a fire. And so depending on the conditions and the areas where you're doing work, instituting a fire watch at the end of that work process could be an important procedure to have in place. Also, we frequently see that we have combustible materials that we store in our facilities, or even flammable materials. that we store in our facilities. Often we'll see in our shops and workshops, gas cans, for small equipment, or other reasons that we may keep fuel cans around. When we talk about flammable liquids, we're talking about a liquid that has a flash point below 140 degrees. In fact, depending on which standard you're looking at, it's different for the construction standard versus the general industry standard. One actually puts that as low as 100 degrees Fahrenheit as the flash point to consider something flammable. Gasoline is definitely below that temperature. In fact, gasoline's flash point, the temperature where its vapors can be ignited, is something like minus 45 degrees. And so if we have those flammable materials that we're using or keeping, we need to make sure that those are stored properly. Gasoline, for example, should be stored in a metal safety can. And if we have these inside of a building that we're occupying, then those should also be stored inside a flammables cabinet, as should other flammables if you have large quantities of those materials in your facility. We want to make sure that when we're using fuel, transferring fuel, filling tanks, that we're grounding and bonding that equipment that we're using to transfer that fuel, because all it takes is a static charge, one static spark, around the vapor of that fuel while we're fueling a piece of equipment or putting fuel into a portable gas can to start a fire. And so make sure that your portable gas cans are grounded on the ground, not in the back of a vehicle before you fill them, and make sure that you have some procedure in place for grounding or bonding your pumping or other fuel transfer equipment when you are putting fuel in your equipment. Manage your inventories too. Sometimes we just see way too much of something stored in a facility. Flammable aerosols is something that we frequently can see just virtually hundreds of cans of flammable aerosols stored in a facility. And if we should have a fire in this facility, as those cans get hotter and hotter, eventually they explode. And when they explode, that flammable liquid inside of them sprays all over the place. And so not only do you have this explosion in flying aerosol cans, but you're also spewing that fuel around to make the fire even worse. And so we should follow the same rule of thumb on these flammable aerosols as we do with other flammable fuels like gasoline. And if you have, say, a good general rule, depending on the occupancy of your building, but if you've got more than 5 gallons worth of this flammable fuel, however it's stored, aerosol or otherwise, let's make sure we have that in a flammables room or in a flammable storage cabinet. Think about what you're buying. Are the chemicals you're buying? Check them as you're getting them and see if they're flammable, so you know ahead of time how you need to store them. And think about alternatives to flammable materials. If there's another chemical that you can get that'll do the same job that doesn't present that potential fire hazard. And another thing is, think about how much do you need. Often we'll see just years and years and years supply of these different flammable aerosols, whether it's paint remover or spray paints themselves, and we do use a lot of that material, but maybe we store it more than we actually need for a reasonable amount of time. And so if you can cut back on your inventory, that's another way to help prevent a fire, or to prevent a fire from getting worse than it needs to be. A common piece of equipment that we'll see in shops is the solvent tank, the parts washer. And pretty much anymore today, most of the new pieces of equipment that we see where someone's bought a new parts washer, they come and they use often in organic, but it is a safe, non-flammable, and sometimes even a non-combustible solvent that they use in those part washers. If you have an old part washer that you use and you're still using an old flammable solvent in there, you might think about changing out that chemical that you're using. for one that's not flammable. If you are using the flammable solvent in your parts washer, make sure that parts washer has a fusible link on there, which is a device that's attached to the lid of the parts washer, where if you get a fire inside the parts washer, that link will melt and let the lid drop closed over the fire, smothering the fire. So be very careful with that equipment, because those often do present a lot of flammable material into your work environment, especially in a way where they could catch on fire. Battery charging is something we see a lot in a lot of our facilities, and we need to be very careful about battery charging. If you have old wet cell batteries that you're charging, it's very important to make sure that those cells are full, and that in the areas where you charge those batteries, that you've got good ventilation in that area. You may need to bring in extra ventilation in that area. A wet cell battery, when it's charging, produces hydrogen gas and can cause these batteries to explode, or even if that gas is leaking off into a closed area, say a room where you're charging those batteries, it could present a significant explosion or fire hazard in that room as well. A lot of batteries today aren't wet cell batteries. We see batteries that have these gel, they have the gel inside of them instead of water, or we have lithium ion batteries. But we do have a lot of battery charging. A lot of our equipment now is battery operated, and so we're recharging the batteries for this portable equipment. And those battery charging operations sometimes will get very hot. And often you can have a fault or a failure in that battery charger that can result in a fire. So be very careful about the areas where you're recharging those batteries, those portable batteries for your electric powered tools and equipment. Make sure that those battery chargers are not sitting on or close to combustible items. You shouldn't have those battery chargers sitting on a wooden shelf, for example, or on top of a cardboard box. We have actually seen fires start in some of our facilities from battery chargers or battery backups, that are stacked adjacent to or on top of cardboard or other combustibles. So make sure any battery charging operations that you've got going on, that you're thinking about, spacing any combustible materials far away from that battery charging operation. And let's be careful about overloading circuits where we have those. And we'll talk about overloading circuits a little bit more here in just a couple of minutes. Let's talk just for a minute about compressed gases. This is something that we see in almost all of our facilities. And the real common things that we see is where we have portable containers that we're using, whether that's for welding or for other equipment that we have that's powered off of propane cylinders. For example, we want to be very careful with the use of these portable tanks that have fuel gas compressed, as well as other gases that are compressed. And where we really have a concern is where you have a fuel gas stored close to or with an oxidizing agent, like oxygen is probably the most common one, where we'll see acetylene and oxygen stored together. Chlorine is also an oxidizer and could promote combustion if you have a fire in where you had these gases stored. So let's make sure we have that 20-foot space, that 20-foot buffer between our fuel gases and any oxidizing gases that we've got in our facility. Make sure that those containers are secured in place. They're very heavy. If they tip over, the fall could damage the valves and cause a release of those gases. And they could even cause a serious injury to a person if they should fall into somebody's leg or onto their foot. And so always make sure that we have good containment and security for our compressed gas storage. Keep the caps on top of the valves on your gas cylinders. Make sure that the valves are shut in the closed or off position. Make sure when you're using that equipment that you're using flashback protection. And again, manage your inventories. Make sure we're not storing more flammable gases or materials in the facility than is really necessary. Storage, material storage is where we see a lot of challenges. Mechanical rooms, electrical service rooms, especially where we've got like water heaters or furnaces or boilers. those are all potential ignition sources for a fire. And we're all short on storage space. And so it's really tempting to store a lot of materials in these mechanical rooms. And we need to make sure that we don't do that. And if we do have any kind of combustible materials stored near electrical panels or heating equipment, we need to make sure we have at least a 3-foot space between that equipment and that combustible material. But an even better rule of thumb is just not to store any combustible materials in these rooms where we have these ignition sources. And that's a real common problem we see. So make sure we get that fuel away from that hot equipment or where sparks may occur around those electrical panels. I want to talk a little bit about electrical hazards. The number one cause of fires in the workplace is electrical faults. And so it's important to understand what kind of hazards we may be dealing with in the workplace that we can control and how to mitigate those hazards when we find them. These are all pictures that we've taken, doing our work here at the Trust, doing inspections. And I've got a few more I'm going to show you as well. And we can see both fire hazards here as well as hazards that could cause an injury to people. And so the panels, the electrical panels, when we don't have those blanks around the circuit breakers or covering open holes, not only could someone possibly get their hand inside there and touch, a live electrical bus or wires, it's also where a spark could come out from that panel if there's, something coming into contact with those wiring back in there. And of course, having that open slots into that panel can also allow dirt and dust and other things to get inside there that could also result in igniting a fire, introducing a fuel back in there around those live wires. So we need to really make sure that we, protect this electrical service and keep combustible materials away from these panels. Also, in an emergency, you may need to be able to access that electrical panel. And so you want to make sure that you aren't blocking that access to those panels. We want to make sure that we don't see tape over breaker switches. I'll show you an example of that in a minute, and we'll talk about why that's dangerous. And also make sure that your cords, that your extension cords are proper, the right size for the job, and in condition to be able to handle the load that you're putting on them. And remember, extension cords are for temporary purposes. They're not for permanent wiring. That's another problem we see a lot, like in this picture in the bottom center here, where we've got cords on this building that are basically just attached to the building. And those cords could get damaged either just from UV exposure or from coming into contact with sharp metal surfaces or just over time rubbing over a sharp edge. And then all of a sudden we have an electrocution or a fire hazard. Another problem that we see a lot is the abandoned circuits, and I'll mention that in just a second. But here's an example of some electrical panels. You could maybe get these doors open in a pinch, but the objects placed in front of the panels could make access to those panels in an emergency difficult. And if we've got combustible materials here, remember, this is also a potential ignition source. So we need to keep things 36 inches away from these electrical panels, that 36-inch space in front of these panels up to 72 inches high. Also, this temporary wiring, lots of times we see some pretty creative ways of getting electricity to where we need it. And this actually is maybe one of the better ones I've seen, where they actually did use some conduit instead of just running the cord through the wall. But what is this really rated for? When we have these home built electrical solutions, we may not be able to be certain that that is going to protect against an overload of that cord or the wiring that we've done there. And obviously this cord on here is subject to damage because it doesn't have, at least on that last part, that protection, in a conduit. So let's make sure that when we're adding electrical service to areas, that we use a qualified electrician to install those circuits and that wiring in a safe manner. We see a lot of instances where we've just kind of done something, whatever we could do in the moment to get the job done. And this really is high risk for, fires when we're doing this. These DIY jobs where, it's not done by a qualified electrician, and all the protection of conduits and insulation and junction boxes isn't in place or being used properly, we can see these fires happen in a hurry, especially like in this example where we've got the wiring right here in and around wooden rafters and wooden structures as well. Another example on this panel box where we just kind of see an ad hoc addition of some wiring into this panel in a way that obviously over time there will be damage to the insulation on these wires that can cause a fault and a fire or electrocution. So let's make sure we do it right and make sure that we're aware of equipment that may be out of date and needs to be updated or repaired or replaced. A lot of you may remember a few months back where we sent out a notice on some electrical panels. I think it was Pacific Electric Corporation put out some panels from the 1950s to the 1980s that have some fire hazard associated with them. And so we need to be aware of any equipment that needs to be updated in our facilities. Here's another example of a permanent wiring solution using a temporary cord. And we can see that this cord has been, wired to and sometimes strapped to, the structure in ways where over time it's going to wear through that insulation on the cord. And then, also there's going to be issues with, are we able to deliver the power needed through a long cord? Or are we going to be able to really know when we're maybe overloading that temporary cord? And so I want you to think about this. A common cause of fire is overloading circuits, where we may have components attached to a circuit that can't handle the power that that circuit produces, or there may be a fault with the circuit protection, the circuit breaker on there. And so it's really important that we be aware of if we're overloading a circuit. And so I just want to give you just kind of a quick rule of thumb as to how you can do that. If you have 120 volts coming into your single phase electrical service, and you have a 15 amp circuit, that is 1800 watts maximum. And so if you've got a power strip and you've plugged in a bunch of different equipments, maybe a space heater or a microwave oven, and some other tools or equipment into there, if the wattage of each of those pieces of equipment is greater than 1800 watts, and that's a 15 amp circuit, then you're going to be running the risk of overloading that circuit. And if there's a fault somewhere in that wiring, then we could also wind up where that wiring melts and sparks and causes a fire. On a 20 amp circuit with 120 volts, you're looking at a maximum of 24 watts. Well, I also want you to think about that with your temporary cords. What is your extension cord rated at? And it'll generally, it'll show you the amps that cord is rated for. And generally we're talking about 120 volt, single phase cord. So look at what the amps are rated for on that cord and multiply it by the number of volts. If that cord is only rated for 10 amps, for example, the maximum you're going to want to draw through that cord is 1200 volts. If you try to draw more than 1200 volts through that cord, it may not trip the breaker because it's a 15 amp breaker. It's probably going to take 1800 watts to trip that breaker, but you're trying to run, more than 1200 watts through that 10 amp cord, then that cord could get hot and melt, and it could cause a fire. And so be really careful with this temporary wiring with your extension cords. Make sure that they're up to the task that you're using them for, especially if you've got retractable cords that roll up onto a reel. That heat, that extra heat that generates inside there could also cause that whole coil of wire to melt if you're trying to draw through too much power through those cords as well. So remember, amps times volts gives you the wattage. And check your cords to see how many amps they're approved for, and then multiply that by 120, and you'll know, the maximum wattage you can try to pull through those cords. Another real common problem that we see is abandoned equipment. And I mentioned before I was going to bring this up. Sometimes we'll see a circuit breaker in the off position, and we'll just put a piece of tape over it so that, and that's supposed to tell people don't turn this, breaker on, right? And it's not uncommon that we will come across these and we'll see this piece of tape hanging in there. And over the years, the adhesive on that tape, just kind of goes away, and that tape falls off eventually. Sometimes we'll open that panel and that tape is just totally fallen off. It's not there anymore. The person who put that tape on there, was trying to protect people because there's something dangerous on the other end of that circuit or in that circuit that we, don't want people to come into contact with that breaker on. But often it's amazing how often the person who did this doesn't work here anymore. People don't know why that breaker is taped off. And so make sure if you've got abandoned equipment or something that's dangerous electrically on a circuit, lock out, tag out that circuit, or remove that abandoned circuit. And then also think about the equipment on that abandoned circuit as well. Does that need to be removed? Or is there wiring that's still attached to a circuit that's been turned off, but the wiring has been cut somewhere, or there's exposed ends on that wiring? And so let's make sure as we cut old wiring from equipment we're not going to use anymore, let's make sure that we cap off and protect the ends of those wires if we can't totally remove them, and also make sure that they're disconnected from the circuit, or that circuit is disconnected altogether. We've had buildings, we've lost entire buildings from this situation. We've got a picture of a burnt water heater here. We lost a public works building years ago from a water heater that was no longer in use. The water was shut off to it, and the circuit breaker that was attached to that electric water heater had one of these pieces of tape stuck over the switch. And many, many years later, that connection was still there. The tape fell off. Somebody turned the circuit breaker on, trying to figure out what the breakers were to, and they left it on, and this, dry, empty water heater, caught on fire and caught the building on fire. So be real careful with that equipment that it's abandoned. Another common cause of fire to our facilities that we've seen that's resulted in some significant damage and losses has been wiring on vehicles. Make sure that if you're installing, electronic equipment to a vehicle or anything that has to do with electrical service to a vehicle, that you're using a qualified installer that understands how to safely add that wiring to that equipment. We've seen instances where radio equipment was wired in a way that caused the vehicle to catch on fire when it was parked and unoccupied. It was a hot, wire that wasn't protected with a circuit, and the car caught on fire. But the car was parked inside of a building, and so not only did the car catch on fire, but the building caught on fire. We saw an example a couple of years ago of a snowplow catching on fire in a snowplow shed, and it burned up the other snowplows as well as the building as well. And so often it may be radio equipment, lights that are added to the vehicle. It could be battery tenders that we're using, or block heaters. Often we will add a block heater to a piece of diesel equipment, or, we'll replace the connection end on the wire going to the block heater. Again, we need to make sure that we have qualified individuals doing any of these repairs or additions to this equipment, because we have seen just catastrophic losses from miswiring of simple items that are on our vehicles sometimes. So be very careful with that. And just take a second and talk about fire extinguishers. It's not fire prevention. We're going to use a fire extinguisher when there is a fire, but we should understand our fire extinguishers. There's basically 5 flavors of fire extinguishers. A, B, C, D, and K are the common ones that we see. Usually your fire extinguisher is going to be an ABC fire extinguisher. In other words, it will work on wood, paper, cloth. Also, it will work on flammable liquids and gases, and it will work on live electrical equipment as well. If you have a fire extinguisher that only identifies itself as A or as B or as C, be aware of that. It's only for the one. If you want to have a fire extinguisher that can handle all of these types of fires, you need to make sure you have an ABC fire extinguisher. A D fire extinguisher is going to be for combustible metals. This is a less common situation where you may have metals that could be reactive and combust. And so again, if you are working with magnesium, lithium, titanium, you want to be aware of that. Make sure you have the appropriate fire extinguisher on hand. And then K for cooking media, especially where you've got big hoods over a commercial cooker. fryer, things like that, you want to make sure that you've got the appropriate K media for fire extinguishing those types of fires. And those are often built into the hood of that equipment. So understand your fire extinguisher. Make sure that your employees, if you expect them to be able to use a fire extinguisher, that you've given them the training on how to use it. You know, the pass, the pull the pin, aim at the base of the fire, squeeze the top handle, and then sweep it from side to side, aiming it there at the base of the fire. And if you can do a live practice, that's a really valuable thing to do as well. But you may not even authorize your employees to fight fires. Sometimes, as a matter of policy, we just tell our employees to evacuate the building and not to put themselves in harm's way by trying to fight a fire. But if this isn't your policy, then you also need to include in your training when you should or shouldn't fight a fire. You know, so you can use the fire extinguisher if policy allows it. If the fire is in its incipient stage, it's just barely starting, it's okay to try and fight that fire with a fire extinguisher. If it's a non-structural fire, it hasn't really caught the building, you know, on fire in a structural way yet. If you have a clear path to an exit, never go in and fight a fire and risk losing your path to the exit, because that fire extinguisher is only going to last 30 seconds and then it's done. And if you feel confident that you have a high degree of, you know, possible success in being able to fight the fire because it is small, it's accessible and so forth, then it's okay to fight fire. But then make sure you're including that training in your employees' training. You may use a fire extinguisher just to clear a path to an exit. That may be another time that you use a fire, not necessarily to put the fire out, but just to put the fire down enough to be able to get yourself to that fire exit. Just kind of wanted to throw out there a great app that I've got on my phone and you might want to look at that gives some great tools for preparing for preventing fires, as well as being prepared when fires occur, is the Red Cross emergency app. And inside that emergency app, among a lot of other things, they have information about wildfires, preventing wildfires, what to do if there's a wildfire, as well as home fires and preventing those fires and safely being able to get out of those. So I highly recommend, you know, that you take a look at that and do additional, you know, homework and study into your particular conditions and facilities that you're working in, or even in your homes, and make sure you have an appropriate plan to both prevent fires from occurring in your workplace or at your home, as well as how to deal with it and how to be safe should a fire occur. So the Red Cross emergency is a great one there to help you with pre-planning some checklists, alerts, and what to do in an emergency. So in summary, for our fire prevention webinar here today, it's important to start out by evaluating your exposures. Make sure you inspect your facilities on a regular basis and identify where you may have hazards or where you may be more at risk, so that you can implement extra controls or make sure that you have other preparations in place. Plan and prepare for the most likely events. And so again, know what your hazards are and make sure you're paying attention to the condition of your equipment, of your facilities, of your electrical system, of your tools like extension cords that you're using, for example, battery chargers, and a lot of these areas where we see common sources of fire. And then regularly review those preparations. If just to go out and inspect it one time doesn't do it, because conditions change. The condition of the cords changes, the condition of your equipment, your property, the combustible materials, that all changes. And keep those spaces clear around your building. You know, keep that combustible material back, make sure dumpsters are moved away from the building. Make sure that combustible material that's away from the building, like dumpsters or piles of pallets or other things, that they're not right next to or underneath power lines as well. We've also seen those fires occur where we then wind up catching the power pole on fire and getting the power lines coming down. And then those power lines come down and spread the fire even more when they come down. So don't just think about your buildings, but look up and be aware of where that infrastructure is as well, and be prepared to help control those hazards in those places. So does anybody have any helpful comments or questions about fire prevention in your workplace?
if you've got questions or comments, go ahead and type those into the chat box and we'll get Doug to answer those right now. I tried to goad people into putting stuff in there now. I wrote something in there and nobody even commented. When you were making your comment about your previous line of work, I put in there, Doug's a lumberjack and he's okay. Nobody even participated there. Wow, this is an important subject this time of year, and really all year round, but especially when we have a drought condition the way we have now, in putting these things in place. Looks like I got nothing there. We've gone a little bit long today, so I think we'll probably just wrap it up at that point. Final word, Doug?
Go out and have a safe day. Thank you very much. And be aware of your surroundings. And if you see a problem, make sure you take care of it.